information security is a subset of cybersecurity. So when you're putting together your program, you need to think of those separately, and you cannot rely on the same tools that you're relying on for cybersecurity as you would for information security. Because when one of those fails, meaning a user's credentials are compromised, does that mean that the information is going to be accessible to the attacker? And if the answer is yes, then you don't have a proper information security plan in your overall cyber plan.
Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes, an IRONSCALES podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IRONSCALES, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey Dimitri, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Yeah, glad to have you here. So before we get into the show, would you mind just telling us a little bit about you, your journey, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Always been enamored by computer science. Took my first coding class in 8th grade. Stuck with it for my entire life. I unfortunately, after high school, lost my way. I went into a college degree that had nothing to do with computer science. Ultimately ended up going to law school, business school, spent about 15 years practicing for a large national law firm. But a bunch of years ago, found my way back into the computer science space and was lucky enough to connect with my co-founder and launch Atakama, which is where I am today as a co-founder and running a pretty successful software company. So back to my roots and quite pleased with it.
That's awesome. So what are you working on these days?
So we are an information security company and laser focused on providing an alternative encryption solution that does not recreate encryption algorithms. We're utilizing standard NIST 256-bit AES encryption, but we have innovated in the way that we manage keys. And instead of relying on, for example, a central authority or login credentials to decrypt, we instead rely on what looks and feels very much like a multi-factor, where you're literally approving the decryption event on your phone. So it's like a multi-factor or single sign-on solution that many people are accustomed to, except we drill that down to the object level. And by doing so and distributing key shards in the way that we distribute them, we're able to disconnect from identity and access mechanisms. And that's really important because if you look at a lot of the attacks that are being perpetrated these days, they in some way or another are trying to compromise an authorized user's credentials. And when that happens, the attacker is able to gain access on a wholesale basis to anything that user has access to. So even if an organization is using an encryption solution, those encryption solutions tend to be tied to, again, either a central authority, right, central key store, or Active Directory permission access management systems. And we, by design, move away from that paradigm, and therefore we're able to provide certain security guarantees that other providers in the marketplace just can't offer. Yeah, so, I got enamored by Bitcoin and blockchain around 2013 and really loved the distributed nature of it, right? The fact that there's no central authority. And to me, what I found really interesting was people are pretty clever and able to compromise security, but to this day, no one's been able in any way to compromise the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So it's a very secure technology. And because it's a very secure technology, my co-founder and I said to ourselves, it's interesting how public-private key pairs are able to allow individuals to protect and store value, right, which is Bitcoin. We said to ourselves, can we do the same thing for passwords? Really simple, right? Can we do the same thing for passwords? So if a user has something sensitive that they want to safeguard, you can password protect it. And in fact, a lot of people do that, right? So if they have files on their laptop, or they have something in Dropbox or G Drive and they want to protect it, they'll put a password around it, something sensitive, or even your password, your list of passwords. Some people have a master password for that list of passwords. And if you think about that on an individual basis, yeah, you can use a password, maybe the same password, not as secure, for your sensitive files. For an organization to do that, you can't really do that. So organizations have tons of sensitive data, and they need to allow their users, their employees, to be able to gain access to that sensitive data. But they also need to secure it, right, against attackers. So theoretically, you could password protect everything within that organization. But then how do you use one password? That's not very. Do you use a different password for every single file? Yeah, that's way more secure. But then how do you share that? How do people remember what the password is? So practically speaking, even though theoretically it may be possible, practically speaking, it's impossible. We do that, right? So our software pretty much encrypts each file with its own encryption key. And you should think of an encryption key as a really long, unhackable password. So each file has its own encryption key. And then our software takes that encryption key, it cuts it up into little pieces. And we distribute those little pieces of the key to physical devices for every single user who should have access to that information. And when you want to decrypt a file, open it, you get a push notification on a mobile app on your phone where you're literally tapping a big green button to send back a piece of the key shard to decrypt that specific file. So it's a way to secure your information without having to memorize passwords, and preventing an attacker from being able to compromise anything that you've encrypted, because somehow they've been able to compromise your user credentials. And our software also works for individuals, right? Because you can just download it from our website and literally start encrypting stuff that you want to prevent an attacker from gaining access to.
As an outsider, if I would try to make the analogy on my own, forgive me if I get it completely wrong, but it sounds sort of like automated two-factor authentication for all your files, that the admins can set those privileges up or set those policies up.
In a way, except that with two-factor authentication, once you've authenticated, everything is open to you. Here, you can think of it as two-factor authentication, but at the object level, at the file level, right? So even if somehow magically someone's able to compromise one of the keys, then what they're able to access is that specific file that was encrypted, protected with that one key. But that has no impact whatsoever on all the other keys, which are different. So if you think of an attacker trying to break an AES 256-bit key, good luck. And then if you want to try to break two of those, it's not 2x more difficult, it's exponentially more difficult, right? So you can think of it as two-factor, but at the object level.
And what threats and problems are you trying to solve with this new technology?
So if you think of cybersecurity as the job of preventing an attacker from gaining access to your castle, right? So if you think of a castle, right, you have really thick walls, you have a deep moat, you have guards, you have a fence, whatever. You have all these perimeter-based preventions, right, to prevent the attackers from gaining access to your castle. What's inside your castle, right? You probably have the crown jewels. Everything sensitive that you want to protect is inside the castle. Attackers are every day attempting to break through that castle. And they're very clever. And they get a lot of return on their effort in trying to compromise that castle wall. The castle wall is the network perimeter. It's the system that they're trying to breach. What happens when the adversary breaks in, which happens every day, right? If you think of breaches, you know, what we read about in the papers are the high-profile breaches. But there are literally hundreds on a daily basis, you know, smaller companies that we've never heard of that may not be newsworthy. But from a regulatory standpoint, these attacks are being perpetrated and reported, because companies have a responsibility, whether it's at the state level in California or some other requirement in New York. You have to report these breaches, and you can literally go on a public website and see the breaches that are being reported by these companies. So this is a real threat. It's happening all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. And not to mention individuals that's a whole separate issue. But when you think of that perimeter and adversaries breaking through that perimeter, what is protecting the sensitive information once they're able to make their way in? And that's where we come in, because we are laser focused on information security. And going back to my analogy with the crown jewels inside the castle, we are protecting those jewels, so that if an attacker is inside the walls of the castle, they see what they think is gold bullion. And they're like, okay, we're going to take all this gold bullion. And when they get into the sunlight, what they see is, wait a minute, this is lead. It's worthless. That's us. That's what we make sensitive information worthless to the attacker, because there's nothing that they can do with it, because the only thing they can steal from an organization is the encrypted version of the file, which again, because we're using military grade NIST standard AES 256-bit encryption, they can't decrypt it.
So how would this tie into ransomware, extortion, insider threats, for example?
So we will not prevent the attack. The attack will happen, right? Anyone who says that they're able to prevent the attack, that's a bold statement. What we do is we mitigate these. So if you are breached, if your systems are breached, if your network is compromised, and an adversary, and people talk about ransomware holistically as this thing, as an umbrella, but ransomware comes in different forms. The old type of ransomware was they would lock up your files and then demand 10 Bitcoin to give you the decryption key. And sometimes you got the key, sometimes you didn't, right? But you paid the ransom, even though FBI is saying don't pay the ransom because we don't negotiate with terrorists, things of that nature. But a company wants to be able to function. That's one form of attack. A more gnarly attack, what we're seeing more of, I would say over the past 12 months to 18 months, is extortionware. And what the attackers have discovered is preventing a company from being unable to access their records. Yeah, that sucks. But if we steal the company's records that are actually customer information, right? Information that's been entrusted to that company by a third party, and the threat of, hey, if you don't pay me my 10 Bitcoin, I'm going to publish this stuff either on the dark web or online. Now the company is saying to themselves, man, okay, not being able to access our stuff sucks. But now if the information that's been entrusted to us is going to leak out there, that's regulatory issues. That's a nightmare from potential liability, right? Legal liability, future business continuity. No one's going to want to work with that entity, reputation risk, all these different things come into play. And those attacks, because the attackers are very smart, unfortunately, they understand that, hey, if I really put the screws to them and really make it really painful for the organization, the chances are they're going to pay me my ransom. And so with that extortionware attack, that's where we come in and we mitigate that attack, because if you are encrypting sensitive information with Atakama, the ability for the adversary on a wholesale basis to get into your organization and one foul swoop, take everything wholesale and basically now threaten to publish it, we make that go away. Because again, the only thing that they're able to take is the encrypted version of the file. So it's a great way to supplement whatever security you have. And by the way, I'm not advocating that any organization or individual should in any way not prevent the adversary from, gaining access to the perimeter. Absolutely. But they should also be considering, there's a term, security in depth. They should also be considering, what do I do when that attacker does breach my perimeter? How do I protect the sensitive information? And that's really where Atakama shines and delivers on its security guarantees.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. And I have not heard many conversations on how you can prevent the extortion once the ransomware has happened before, which kind of takes me to my next question. What's standing in companies' ways? Why can't they solve it by themselves? Why can't they encrypt their own files with existing technology today?
Because what I would describe as conventional encryption really doesn't lend itself to prevent that type of attack. And here's why. a user comes into work in the morning, they log into their machine, they get a pop-up on their phone, it's the multi-factor, right? And they tap approve. And now the system has recognized that user as being authenticated. They've authenticated themselves into the system. Everything that user has access to is now available to them, wholesale, okay? So now if an adversary is able to trick the system to believing that I am the attacker's that authorized user, well, guess what? Everything that I as the authorized user have access to is now available to that attacker. Similarly, these attackers, they stealthily get into the system and they see where the honeypot of information is. So if a company is using the cloud or they have on-prem file servers, those files are decrypted. They're not encrypted. The only time they're encrypted potentially is when the server is offline. And that may have happened 20 years ago where servers were offline over the weekend. Not today. Today, server uptime is 24/7, 365. They're always running because users, and especially now with COVID, you have users, working remotely and they need access to their information. The servers are not down. And so the information on those servers, it's live. It's always available. It's always there. And that's why these adversaries, are able to get in there and start pilfering, stealing, exfiltrating all this data. So the conventional encryption solutions like full disk or full volume, or solutions that rely on a central authority, a key store with certificates, and it's basically saying, okay, this is an authorized user and I'm going to release keys to this authorized user so they can decrypt these files. Again, if I'm an attacker, I can trick that into believing that central authority to send me keys so that I can basically access anything I want to access. So, a company on its own can only go so far with the tools that it has in front of it. That's why innovative solutions like ours are in play, because the attackers are consistently looking at ways to game the system, to take advantage of the existing tools that cybersecurity practitioners are using on a daily basis. So it's very hard to stay, ahead of these attackers because, like I said, they're intelligent, and you would think that as smart as they are, they would use their intelligence for good. But they're making a lot of money by using their skill sets to do bad. And so companies that want to prevent these attacks consistently need to be out there looking at the new technologies and implementing those new technologies to try to stay ahead inevitably of that race against the bad guys.
CyberSecurity Heroes is brought to you by IRONSCALES, an AI-powered self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
So 2 follow-up points. First, it's another analogy. If I understood correctly, this would be like if you lost your phone and someone had your face, they could get into the phone, but then each app is encrypted, so the phone is essentially useless to them because you've encrypted at the app level, or as you said, at the file level.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy, and there's actually a technical term for that. It's containerization. And in fact, there are companies that are working on that because, believe it or not, malicious software on your phone can jump from one app to another inside your phone. And it would be way better to segregate those apps so that, you couldn't just interchangeably move from one app to another, because that is an attack surface. You're absolutely right. So in a way, it's very similar to that. So just because I got into your phone doesn't mean I'm able to access any apps on your phone. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
And second follow-up question was, you talked about companies need to keep up with technology to stay ahead of attackers, but you hear a lot of anti-technology talk from a lot of folks because and I agree with them that a lot of cybersecurity is process-driven, people and process. But what you're saying is, no, in your space, you need technology as that sort of defense in depth layer, because people and process can take you so far with encryption or the encryption technology that exists today.
It's actually, I'll flip that on its head. Our software is old school technology, and here's what I mean. And you're absolutely right. These automated processes, the fact that almost everything is, quote, cloud, the fact that things are SaaS-based, that creates a nightmare for the security professionals. Why? Because if you think about Microsoft, right? If I have Microsoft running on my machine as an individual, my password is not being shared randomly with all these different disparate systems. Now you move into Active Directory, centralized, and my password is all over the place. All these disparate systems are looking at it. And Active Directory, my password to all these systems. And all of that creates a potential attack. It's exposure at every step of the way. And on top of that, any process that's automated where you don't have that human interaction or intervention, that can be gained. Anything that's automated can be gained, okay? With our software, because we are old school, we are not SaaS, we run on the endpoint, so you download the software. And the fact that there's a human element involved, the human actually has to tap to approve to decrypt the file, that action on a secondary device is what allows us to have the security that we do. Because if it wasn't that, if it was just like, oh, I need to decrypt the file, let me click on the file and it automatically decrypts, there's no security there. None. It's window dressing. But because you have the secondary device and you're affirmatively doing that extra step, that human friction, if you will, right? The slight deviation from your existing user workflow is what brings a level of security that the status quo just cannot deliver.
That's really interesting. I wanted to take it back to something we were talking about previously on our call. You mentioned that there's a confusion between cybersecurity and information security.
Yeah, a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, and I think that's a mistake. I think people in the space, right, security practitioners, security professionals, really need to have the mindset and understand that information security is a subset of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, again, going back to that analogy, cybersecurity is that castle. Cybersecurity is focused on the systems, the hardware, the network. How do I keep the bad guy from getting in? That's cybersecurity. Information security is focused on the information itself. How do I prevent the bad guy from gaining access to the information? And you cannot rely on information security or to prevent, like information security should not rely on the same pillars that the cybersecurity is relying on. So if you're using certain tools, right, in your cybersecurity tech stack to prevent the bad guy from getting in, that's not enough to say, oh, because I'm pretty buttoned up here, the bad guy can't get in. That's a bad mindset. You should assume that the bad guy has already made their way in or will eventually make their way in. And that's going to force you to think about, okay, what happens then? Is it sufficient to just rely on the perimeter? Or should I now be thinking more granularly? And how do I prevent the bad guy from gaining access to the sensitive information when they do make their way in, right? So it's a mindset, and it's very important to understand that information security and cybersecurity, are not the same thing, and that information security is a subset of cybersecurity. So when you're putting together your program, you need to think of those separately, and you cannot rely on the same tools that you're relying on for cybersecurity as you would for information security. Because when one of those fails, meaning a user's credentials are compromised, does that mean that the information is going to be accessible to the attacker? And if the answer is yes, then you don't have a proper information security plan in your overall cyber plan.
And rolling with this topic, what category would you say you're in or developing? Is encryption a standalone category within the cybersecurity?
It's an interesting question. Depends who you ask, right? Because I think a lot of security folks think that encryption, check the box, it's solved for, right? Because either you're using BitLocker or full disk or full volume, or you're using the cloud and just assuming that because you're using the cloud, everything's encrypted in the cloud. My experience is a lot of folks that are tasked with with administering a company's cyber and information security programs are not thinking about encryption. They're not thinking about encryption because it's been decades since encryption was really innovated on. And I'm not talking about encryption algorithms are great, right, at what they're designed for, which is preventing a third party from accessing anything that you've encrypted, right? The encryption algorithms are sound. No one's questioning that. But it's the way that those encryption algorithms are deployed. And again, because most tools deploy those encryption algorithms by connecting them to some form of identity and access management controls, a lot of folks just have become, comfortable with the existing solutions that exist in the market. And when we show our solution, it forces the individual to think about things that maybe they're not comfortable thinking about or have not, to that point, really thought about. And when they see it, I get this term a lot. They say, wow, I've never seen anyone do it that way. And that's problematic for me. It's great on the one hand, for sure, but it's problematic on the other. And here's why. It means they're not thinking about the problem. And if they're not thinking about the problem, that creates an attack surface, an attack vector for the bad guy. So you have to think about it. You have to understand how it interplays, and you can't just rely on your laurels because, that's the way it's been done, and therefore there's no other way to do it. You always have to try to understand what's available out there and what you can deploy to really fill those gaps.
Let's play the devil's advocate. I'm just trying to think on the top of my head if there's any company that would be like, we don't care if any information gets out. I'm just curious what obstacles or objections.
Yeah. So let me flip that back, right? You as an individual, forget about a company, you as an individual. Do you have anything that's sensitive that you want to protect?
Kids, photos, your
banking. Your banking, your taxes, right? And I get that a lot, from both individuals and some companies. Individuals will be apathetic to the question, I'm a little guy, no one cares about me, I'm not important. I'm using Google. Google is going to protect me. No, Google's not going to protect you. That's number one. Google reads your, information. So every individual has something, whether it's, like we said, tax returns, banking information, personal photos, or things of that nature that you wouldn't want to be exposed out there. It's personal in nature. It's something that belongs to you. You don't want that third party to gain access to it. I can't think of a single company that doesn't have something that is proprietary to them. Yeah, right? Companies tend not to have things that are personal, but proprietary things. Your formation documents. Any company that's formed has certain legal documents. Any company that's formed has financial documents. Any company that's formed has potentially customer information, maybe not. Or a company like ours, which does not collect anything from the customer, does not collect any of the customer data, stays on-prem, but we have code, right? Very sensitive, right? That's our IP, and we wouldn't want somebody accessing our code. So I think if you peel back that onion, you'll find that any company that initially says, we don't have anything, really? You don't have anything? And that's fine, because some companies don't care about security. And that's okay. That's not a good customer for us.
Yeah. No, the more you talk about it, the more you start to think about, okay, maybe they don't extort us, but where is that data going if we don't pay the ransom? Maybe to the dark web. What will thousands or hundreds of thousands of other folks do with that information? And I guess the scary part is you don't know what you don't know.
That's exactly right. You just hit the nail on the head. It's thinking about it. And when you start thinking about it, you're going to be more aware of it, right? So we're still in the midst of a pandemic, right? COVID. I guarantee you a lot of people since COVID have changed their mindset when it comes to something as simple as washing your hands. I certainly, and I'm not a germaphobe, but I've always, after I come home from outside or I come to work in the morning, first thing I do is I wash my hands. But in the middle of the day, if I go pick up lunch, will I wash my hands before COVID? No. Now I'm washing my hands again. So I'm thinking about it and I'm being more aware of it, right? And I think with cybersecurity, it's similar because we're reading about more of these attacks. It's become more front page news. We have the White House coming out with executive orders, so it's become more top-down. And I would also say at companies where it was a security professional telling the business people, hey, I need budget because we need to button these things up. Even 5 years ago, they would get a lot of pushback. Now it's top-down. You have the boards of companies, the CEO's office basically saying, hey, this could affect our stock price. Our customers could get pissed at us. It could affect us financially, regulatory litigation, again, all those things. So everyone's become a lot more attuned to the issue and are focused on it.
When you're having these discussions, what is your talk track with your ideal customer? What's that kind of aha moment for them?
Yeah, it's really seeing the fact that because our software is untethered from their other systems, they really like that. Because if you think of a bank, right, just simplistically, if in the bank where you have all the safety deposit boxes, right, there's a reason why, if you think about it, the bank has guards, it's locked, the outside, then you have a vault, a really big vault, and then inside the vault, you have 2 keys that you need to turn to pull out your safety deposit box. In a way, what they've done is, most organizations, is they have that guard, they have that door, they likely have that vault, but then everything inside the vault is just sitting there. So if I legitimately have access to that vault, I go in there, and if I didn't have that key safety deposit box, and I walked by and said, oh man, that's a big diamond, woo! Right? And that's the equivalent, right? So here, it's basically, okay, you've got the outdoor, the guard, the front door, you've got that vault, and now everything that is important to you is locked down. And when they realize that, it changes the mindset, it changes the dynamic, and they say to themselves, yes, I want that, because it's real security as opposed to a lot of what's out there, which is window dressing.
Let's go one step further. So you're in your proof of concept with the customer. How do you navigate the frictionless work experience? How does your software keep with their workflows?
No, that's a fair question. We deal with that quite a bit. And so at the end of the day, a lot of what we do is optimize for that. So as a security practitioner, there's always this balance, right? So if you think about it, you can make things incredibly secure, but then you'll make it unusable, right? Where the users just, like you could unplug from, the internet. No more internet. We're safe. But then you really can't function as an organization. And with our solution, we struggle with that. So what we've done is we've introduced some performance hacks, if you will. So you can, as an organization, require your users to have to tap approve for every single file that they open up. But you don't have to. So we've introduced a little flexibility. So the user with our device has to at least one day tap on their big green button. And what they can do is, instead of opening one file, they can launch a session window. And during that session window, you can open up a maximum number of files over a maximum number of hours. So if the organization says, you know what, we're comfortable with our users opening 50 files over 8 hours, that's the workday. So the user comes in the morning, they log into their machine, they go to open the first file, they get that push notification on their phone, they tap the big green button, they launch that session window, and that's it. And everything remains encrypted until they go to open the file. When they go to open the file, the phone behind the scenes is sending back the key shard for the files that they're opening, but everything is still encrypted, right? So there's always that balance, and it's a very difficult balance for security practitioners to strike.
And obviously, you don't have to have the same level of security for every employee, right?
Yeah, or even file types. If you have certain files that are, public, you don't need to encrypt them. If you have other new things, you mentioned IP and things that are very specific to that organization, have high value to that organization, yeah, you want to encrypt that. You want to secure it.
Awesome. So as we wrap up here today, is there anything else you would like to add before we close out today's episode?
Yeah, I think it's really important not to be apathetic about these types of issues, whether you're an individual or an organization. It's always important to try to be ahead of the curve. And when I say be ahead of the curve, it's not to say, hey, just blindly adopt any new technology, but it's like the equivalent of a regression analysis. Looking backwards is not necessarily going to inform you for how to do things best practice-wise in the future. And unfortunately, you do, in this position, have to be prospective. You have to anticipate things before they happen and try to get ahead of them. And individuals likewise. And I don't care who you're saying to yourself that, no one cares about me, no one's going to want to attack me. That's wrong. And that mindset needs to change, because we are a mobile society. We are online all the time, especially with our devices. We have an online presence. So whether we like it or not, whether we want to believe it or not, the reality is we are targets, all of us. And it's not a question of if, unfortunately, it's a question of when. So people really need to be thoughtful when it comes to their personal and their organizational security.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. And if anyone would like to keep in touch with you, pick your brain a little more on this topic, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, of course. They can email me directly. It's Dimitri, Dimitri, at Atakama, Atakama.com. Or you can email us at info@atakama.com, and you could visit our website at www.atakama.com.
And are you a LinkedIn guy as well?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. If you want to DM me, always happy to make new connections.
So I'll definitely include all of that in the show notes. So thank you so much again for joining us today on Cybersecurity Heroes, and to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.